Hi everyone, so today I'm going to speak about salmon and shrimp aquaculture. I'll give you a quick update. My name is Gorjan Nikolik, I work for Rabobank Group. Rabobank is a bank that started, I believe, 1890s in the Netherlands, founded by farmers, but since then it has grown into a global agricultural lender. And as such, we're also a lender to the salmonid and shrimp farming industries globally. You can see on this page all the offices that we have worldwide. So continuing forward, let's get into the salmon situation. The way the structure of this presentation is that I'll first talk a little bit about how the sector was before Corona and then during, and then I'll try to have a view on the midterm outlook. So the salmon aquaculture industry was in a good place before Corona struck. We were basically enjoying what we call a long-term high price scenario starting somewhere around 2016. That's when there was an algae outbreak in Chile, prices adjusted up, but supply could never really keep up with demand. So if you look at Norwegian prices, we were thinking about a new normal, which was around 60 NOK per kilogram, which was very profitable for the industry. Then if you look at, let's say, the supply outlook, this picture shows you what the current expectations are, around 2% growth in 2020, about 1.9% growth in 2021. Actually, we only dropped these slightly after Corona, maybe about 1.5% was the only ability for the industry to reduce supply. So we were already expecting very tight supply in an industry that was already having a high price point. So a good way to enter a difficult time. We talk to the industry on a day-to-day basis, and I would like to kind of give you a quick review of what are all the things that have happened before we get into some of the data points, which are mostly prices. So, I mean, as everybody knows, it's the food service that really hurt the salmon industry, as any really seafood industry. In the US especially. So in US, the consumption at food service level is maybe 40 to 50%. It's somewhat less in Europe, perhaps 30%. So when the demand dropped at food service and it grew at food retail, the net loss is the most significant in the US. And this is really the main driver of the price drop and the main pain point for the industry. If you think about logistics and labor, some things that we hear a lot about in other sectors, I would say the salmonid industry probably somewhat less impacted. At farming level, the impact is minimal. There are some issues at processing level. That's where most people are employed. We did hear about some plants that had to be closed in Chile, and perhaps in some weeks capacity was reduced by maybe as much as 30%. But overall, it was fairly limited amount of absenteeism and a limited impact on the overall industry from a labor and logistics point of view. Bottom line, if we start with the conclusion of this presentation, is that in the salmon sector, we're going to have some losses primarily due to a low price point, but production and volumes have not been impacted that much. And we do expect a recovery before the end of this year, at least in prices. So let's see what are some of the different price points that we are observing here. This is a Oslo market where you have a large trade of fish, fresh fish products. One of the things you see is this blue line is the 2020 drop in prices. It's quite significant in NOK terms, really falling from almost 80 to slightly above 50 NOK. We are now stable around 53 NOK. The second thing you see is that actually exports per week are hardly different than last year, almost the same. When we see where they're going, there's been a marked recovery already of China for quite a few weeks, maybe 4 or 5 weeks. You see it here in the right corner. Also, even Italy reached the bottom and recovered. And this is the main market in the EU. fairly stable at 80% of Norwegian exports. And here's really where retail has really come strong and delivered demand. One of the very important things why European retail demand has been so strong is because at the same time as the salmon prices came down, the NOK also depreciated. So the price in euro is even lower. Actually, it has dropped from 8 to 4. You almost a 50% drop. So you're getting a major discount on the salmon in Europe at retail due to the major depreciation of the NOK, which in turn is related to the oil prices. So with this kind of low prices, I think we should expect very good retail demand of salmon in Europe. Across the pond in the US, these are some of the price charts that we observe. Now, this is the first picture is the index. This is all the different salmon products. It's dropping quite sharply. The main driver of the drop is the whole fish. This is the product that really goes into food service, and you can see it on the right side, especially the large whole fish dropping pretty strongly, more than 50% loss in value, but from a high point. The product that's very important for the Chilean industry and is a very high value product is the fillet. And you notice in the corner that this is the product that maintained its price for quite some time, around $5 per pound, and then really dropped only starting around April. And if you see this on a longer time period, it's definitely an important drop, but it's not as bad yet as it was in 2016 and back in 2013 when the industry made pretty significant losses. So this is a challenging time for the Chilean industry, but they've seen worse, and I think they'll be recovering fairly soon from this. The US retail picture, this is data that Erna Berry collects, and they have noticed that at retail point already the prices for salmon are falling, so some 43 cents on average lower in the US. And I think this, together with some of the issues of the meat industry and the importance of people cooking at home these days, should really drive the salmon consumption. So overall, I would say so far this should be roughly the bottom of the salmon industry. I don't think that there will be much more reductions in price and in demand. We've basically reached bottom. The way up is going to be perhaps something difficult to forecast. One of the things that you can look at are, luckily in salmon, we have futures prices. So what you're seeing now is 3 snapshots of the futures price back in February, March, and April. And what you see, of course, that it shifted down. That's normal when you have a decline in price. The environment is weaker demand, so the price shifted down. But interestingly enough is to see that there is a expected increase somewhere around mid to end 2020. The price comes back. It's not as high as the previous, let's say, old price, but it's significant. It's back to 60 NOK. And that's what at least this fairly thinly, I have to say, fairly thinly traded product is indicating. Today, I downloaded the most recent contract prices, and it looks like there is a contract for Q1 and Q2 of 2020 already for 61 NOK. It is assuming, though, a very weak euro NOK relationship, which of course boosts this number. So in the salmon sector, I would say, if this is any guidance in some of the things that people have told us in the industry, the increasing demand from retail, the bottoming out of the loss in demand at food service, this could be a realistic scenario. It will still be a difficult year, nevertheless, but at least we have a recovery in sight. So that's, I guess, so far for me talking about the salmon industry. Let's get into the shrimp for the second half of the presentation. So shrimp is a totally different sector than salmon. It's an industry that had a very difficult period even before the corona came up. This is a price a long-term price figure, and you see the shrimp prices really coming down since that crisis we had back in January 2014, when we had a major supply shortage due to the EMS disease. Frankly, since then, the sector has been growing, recovering, and 2019 was a particularly strong year of growth of supply, and prices came down. The next slide shows you what people thought the shrimp supply would look like back in November 2019 and back in January 2020, so just before Corona. In fact, I was presenting at the Gold Conference, and remember in India there was a lot of optimism back then. People said India could grow by 7%, Ecuador by 9%, Vietnam by 13%. A couple of months later, I believe the NFI was in Miami in January. I didn't go there, but again, optimism, 6% for the major producers. Only Indonesia switched to somewhat negative territory. So the sector was gearing up for big supply, and it doesn't look good when you're gearing up for big supply and suddenly, the demand just disappears. So what can we see happen these days? Similarly to salmon, a major drop in demand, particularly coming from the food service sector. But in here, it happened first in China. In salmon, China is not so important, but in shrimp, it's very important. Not only that, the corona happened during the Lunar New Year. This is the high point in consumption. So all that product that was supposed to go to China then went to the US and Europe, only to find that there the demand had disappeared. So the demand loss was quite severe, and it's now recovering, but slowly. On the supply side, I would say that we're hearing more significant interruptions than we had in the salmon industry. We're seeing hatchery. Initially, certainly, there were lockdowns in countries like India, where hatcheries and feed companies could not bring the product to the farms. Farmers could not export their product because port facilities were under lockdown. And there was even absenteeism. So I'll go through some of these issues a little bit in more detail on a per country basis, because they're all very different. But certainly major supply side disruption, a lot more than in salmon. The bottom line is, I think that this sector is going from just about break even to considerable losses at farm level. Farmers will be hurt and they will lose money, and there will be, and unlike salmon, this sector can change its supply. So seeding rates, production will come down. I don't know how much exactly, we'll talk about it perhaps later, but there will be a supply reaction here. So a negative supply is coming, particularly in the summer. So let's go through some of these slides and some of these details that I mentioned. This is US import data in January and February. And like I said, when there was no Chinese demand, all the major exporters really focused on the US. And look at these numbers, double-digit growth. India, 30% growth. Indonesia, 25%. Ecuador, 53% growth. This is them sending shrimp to the US because China is not buying. But this shrimp obviously is not being consumed now. And this is the result in the price. So we already had a fairly low price point in 2019. That's the blue line. And look what happened in 2020, just sliding down to almost a record low point. This is the US Farm Shrimp Index from a buyer perspective. So there are many products here. The next slide go on country by country. And one of the things that this is Ecuador. This is one of the major producers, second producer after India. And they are the first to get hit because they supply China primarily. 68% of their export go to China. So already in January, they had this major drop in price. Then there was a slight hope that, okay, maybe the Americans and the Europeans will buy this. But then the reality hit and it was clear that there was no one going to be buying this product, and the volumes were big. They were coming forward with the plan that they had to grow. So the price really crashed. It's I would say it's almost a 50% price. And now we're seeing some improvement. Finally, the Chinese market is coming back. Actually, I found it really amazing to see some of these Ecuadorian export numbers. This is the Q1 exports of Ecuador, and they actually had 17% more volume they delivered. Only in March that they really started to decline. So bringing more product to a market that has less demand is basically the result what you saw in that price figure. You know, you get 50% less for your shrimp now. Very challenging situation for the exporters. I'll quickly run through some of the other countries. So this is India, somewhat of a less sharp price decline because they're more exposed to the US, so they didn't get that initial hit going to China. And quite quickly, the government introduced a minimum price guarantee, which put a floor to really safeguard all those smallholder farmers in India who were about to lose their livelihoods. So there was this guarantee. It's now effective until March 18th. It was, in fact, prolonged a couple of times, but now we hear that India is starting now to export again, and the farmers are now back into their fields and they're bringing in new seeds. So it's starting to recover. But this was a very painful moment, and still the prices are probably at or below cost. Here comes the next one is Vietnam. If you remember, I mentioned earlier on, Vietnam was very bullish before Corona, and they had this price that was going up was the reason for their bullishness. But then again, that twofold decline. First, China not buying, and then Vietnam realizing that the United States and Europe are also not buying. So then a second correction. In Vietnam, however, we've seen a healthy recovery because the Chinese have opened their market, and this is the first country where they've bought shrimp, and you see it's coming back up again. However, it's still a very low price, and we do hear that the farmers are doing well and they're seeding now back to normal, but I wonder how much they can recover at this price point. In the past, when we had a similar price point, they did not seed fully. So let's see how much the effect of this will be for them. The final country that I want to talk about too is Indonesia. Now that was a country already had issues with disease, and when the Corona came, not only did the US market, which they depend very heavily on, was shut, but also the strong domestic market, something like 35% of their market of their sales are to the domestic, let's say, food service sector. Both of them were shut, so a very sharp decline. And also, luckily, now we see the first couple of weeks, already 2 weeks of recovery. But this is certainly not a price point that will allow the industry to recover the volumes of the past. So again, let's see what the total impact will be. So let's say if I'm trying to conclude here our view of the sector. The shrimp industry clearly is hurt quite heavily. The supply side was hurt strongly, but maybe that's recovering. The demand side is not yet recovered. I took this slide from a presentation from the NFI, whereby they interviewed people asking them, when will you resume some activities when the lockdown is lifted? And an important one is going to a restaurant. This is very important for shrimp consumption. And it says, according to this survey, that what I found important was that 41% of people said that it will take them 1 to 5 months to go back to a restaurant again. And 20% even said more than 6 months. That's concerning. I would say that means that we're going to have a severely depressed demand curve for the rest of this year, which means if supply from the shrimp side is anywhere close to what it was last year, we will still have the low price. Some of the speculation in the market is that perhaps the supply will be even reacting so much to the current low point that at some point they will need to have a shortage. So I guess that's the only point I will leave this presentation. It's high uncertainty, both on the supply side and on the demand side. And this is certainly a very unsettled market that we're going in and uncharted territories. Thank you for listening. I hope you found it interesting.